The first new Sony lens of the year is a 24-70 minus the 4. That makes it a 2070, by the way, in case anyone was getting their hopes up for a 2-70. This is a G-badged f4 zoom lens, so that kind of sets expectations in terms of what range this lens sits in. If this was, say, an f2.8, then I'm pretty sure it would have gotten an orange G instead of a black one. Well, that, and it would probably annoy the heck out of everyone who just bought a shiny new 24-70 GM Mark II. But this new lens's battle is against the f4 24-70s, the status quo for lightweight standard zooms. Step into a room with this, and it's a bit like having a filet mignon at a table where everyone else is having round steaks. You're very close to being just like everyone else, except you're just better. This superiority you get with the 2070 is entirely down to that 4mm wider wide end, you know, this much wider. I know I sound like I'm being sarcastic, but it really is substantial enough to set this lens apart. That much wider is enough to push this lens into the ultra-wide category. It's also enough to have you consider not having to bring along a 16-35 in addition to a 24-70, because on this, the wide end actually feels properly wide now. Being an f4, I also doubt this lens is going to be the one that gets stopped down the most often. Fortunately for that, wide open performance is extremely satisfactory at all focal lengths. It's superbly sharp for center framed subjects. You do lose a touch of resolution at the edges, but still very good for a zoom lens. The way it suppresses chromatic aberration, absolutely top notch, definitely a non-issue. And aside from some vignetting being noticeable at the wide end, I would actually consider the optical performance of this 2070G to be G-Master worthy, because it surely meets that tier of expectations for a zoom lens. The bokeh out of this lens is decent. It's not the best looking from Sony, but it's also far from being the worst. Again, being an f4 standard zoom, bokeh probably isn't the first thing that comes to mind when somebody brings this lens up, but it's still very worth mentioning considering this lens's excellent close-up capabilities. Your working distance at its minimum focus of 0.25 meters is only a few inches away from the front element. At the 70mm tele-end, that gives you a magnification just shy of 0.4 times, which is enough to fill the frame with small subjects. This is that one convenience factor that further cements this 2070 as the new king of versatility, because just like the 2470s, which have always pretty much been the perfect all-rounders for both stills and video, this builds upon that by being unusually wide as well. In fact, the wide end of this matches the focal length of one of Sony's best vlogging lenses, the 1.8G. Except when you're pointing the camera away from yourself with this, you also have the luxury of zooming in to 70. So for use cases when you can't be bothered to change lenses like traveling or solo vlogging, this is more or less the perfect answer. It's not that it's impossible to hold the camera up and film yourself if the widest you could go was 24mm, it's just when you can punch out slightly wider to 20mm, it makes it that much easier to get shots like this. All that being said, this actually isn't the lightest nor smallest standard zoom lens. Say if we compare it against the Sony Zeiss 24-70 f4, this 2070 is actually slightly bigger and heavier, but at just under half a kilogram, you can't really call this lens heavy either. Let's just say if the footprints of an 85 or 50 GM does not bother you, this lens should barely weigh you down by comparison. Being a new and modern G lens also means it comes standard with all the bells and whistles. It's got an iris ring, which is not only declickable, it's also lockable to prevent you from accidentally shifting in or out of the A position. You get 2 custom buttons on the lens and of course an autofocus toggle. If you're coming from the 24-70 ZA, this AF-MF switch right here, that's all the reason to upgrade. The 2070 also does 2 things very well, which I guarantee will impress video shooters. First of which is how well it controls focus breathing. Now, it's not to the extent of 0, but if you're on the tele end, it's practically invisible during focus racks. The other neat thing for video is how the focus plane seems to not shift at all as you zoom in or out. So it behaves like a parfocal cine lens where you don't have to worry about losing focus while zooming, particularly if you're using monofocus. On pretty much all the newer Sony lenses, monofocus by wire response has been basically perfect. They're linear and instantaneous. On this lens in particular, the focus group is driven by 2 XD linear motors, so frictionless, silent, and blazing fast. That means for autofocus, you're not likely at all to have complaints with this. In truth though, as versatile and well-performing as this lens is, I do find it to be in a slightly awkward position. If, say, I was just starting out with photos and videos, then surely this is an excellent choice. But I might be put off by how it's a bit premium. In Malaysia, it's going to be retailing for 5,399 ringgit, so that's a few $100s more than $1,000 US. Meanwhile, for the working professional photographer, they'll be likely to go for the very best moneymakers, the f2.8 GMs. And that really puts this 2070 in that enthusiast category. Also, to a fairly large extent, it really comes down to how much you value that wider end of 20mm for your work. But when it does come down to it, if you're willing to spend the money on this lens, then it's got the performance and the quality to back that price tag up. Still, I love how Sony's challenging boundaries of the 2470 category with this. In fact, we've gotten so familiar with 2470s, it might be easier to think of this lens as a 2470 plus, or minus in this case. Either way, as somebody who's doing a piece to camera, I do appreciate that it's one less syllable to pronounce. Just 2070. I'm rambling now. Anyway, if you enjoyed this, I might just see you in one of my other videos then.